Hey guys, we're going to start something a little different today. So instead of taping myself with my iPad, we're just going to screencast my computer. I think that'll work a little bit better. So in this section of our video, we're going to start talking about the idea of communism. Okay, one of the hardest areas of this test for students to grasp. So where we left off in the history, we were looking at the two great czars, Peter and Catherine the Great. So we remember they were given the title the Great because they made Russia so big. They gained a whole bunch of land. Okay, so if we look at Russia, they got really big and they were really powerful all the way up until the 1800s. And in the 1800s, a new country is going to threaten that power a little bit. So we might say, well, why would one country threaten another? We know that all countries during this time frame really wanted land. And the reason they wanted land is because land equaled money and power. So France is going to be the country that threatens Russia in the 1800s. The leader of the French was the man that you were looking at in that picture. His name is Napoleon. Now, we don't go into Napoleon a whole bunch, but Napoleon had huge dreams, okay, for his existence in France. And what he wanted to do was make France this huge country. And Napoleon had really good ideas, but as luck would have it, none of them ever really panned out for Napoleon. So Napoleon Bonaparte is going to take France into Russia in 1812. So in 1812, France decides to invade them and take over. And they didn't invade with 100 soldiers or 1,000 soldiers, but Napoleon led his men, okay, which numbered 600,000 soldiers. Russia was not really prepared for this invasion because they were the most powerful at this time. So as the French came in, they're going to move very quickly across the flat land, and they're going to be able to capture cities like Moscow very quickly on. Now, if we look at this next statement, captured Moscow, and the Russians fled. They set fires. Okay, so two things are at play. First, if they capture Moscow, wouldn't Russia be already taken over because Moscow is the capital of Russia today? Okay, but at this time, remember, Peter the Great built a new capital and he named it after himself, St. Petersburg. So at this time, Moscow was not the current capital. And then we might say, well, why would all these Russians set fires to their cities at this time? The reason they set fires was to leave the incoming enemy without any supplies, no shelter, no food, no weaponry left behind. Okay, and that would happen in any war. But in this war, what's going to make it really bad is that once the French, okay, are trying to settle down in these cities and they don't have or can't take any of the supplies from the Russian cities and they have no shelter, okay, the problem is that Russia is going to set into a season, and that season is going to be called winter. Winter is actually going to save Russia a number of times throughout their history. So we talked about their winter before. We said winters in Russia are long and cold, and that huge middle section of Russia, they get that huge amount of snow. Okay, so the French have no shelter in these cities because they were all set on fire. Okay, their supply routes, once winter started, were cut off. They couldn't maintain their supplies. They couldn't get supplies from France into Russia in any time. There's too much snow. It's too cold. And what ends up happening, all those soldiers in Russia are now going to start running out of things. They run out of clothes. They run out of food. No new troops are coming to replace them. So Napoleon is faced with a really big decision. He's this close to taking over Russia, right? But if he stays, all his soldiers will die. So he can either surrender, okay, stay until the death, or he can retreat. Much to Napoleon's dismay, they had to retreat. Okay, so if we look at Napoleon, Napoleon is going to leave with 100,000 men. Only 30,000 actually made it back to France. Okay, so Russia itself was saved, okay, from France simply because of winter. If winter didn't set, you know, we could almost predict that Napoleon would have been successful in taking over the largest area in the world. With the French threat ended, okay, we would say that Russia went back to normal. But then we might say, well, what is normal? Okay, at this time, no matter what Russia's side was, they continued on with the same type of government they used way in the beginning of the Tsars. Okay, if we go way back to the Vikings and the Mongols. And that was the type of feudalism. And we looked at feudalism in the last unit. We said that feudalism is where you have your leader, like a king or a czar. They rule the country. Then we have the group of nobles who run the land, and then the peasants, the big part of the population, does all the work. Okay, so the problem with this is a lot of the peasants do all the work and they're paid very little. Some people were paid so little that they ended up becoming serfs. Okay, serfdom is similar to slavery. It's not the same. But in serfdom, they're tied to the land. They work long hours. But in a serfdom situation, they would work until they were able to pay off their debt. Once their debt was paid through working, they were released. A slave was a slave for life. Okay, they couldn't work anything off. Okay, so the one small difference. Now, as history goes on, and this applies to our country as well, people realized, okay, that serfdom wasn't correct. Slavery wasn't correct. So across the world in the 1800s, countries started to abolish slavery and abolish serfdom, and they made it illegal for people to actually own other human beings. Okay, so in 1861, Russia abolishes serfdom. They get rid of it. Okay, but the problem is these serfs had nowhere to go. They didn't have enough money to go into a different place or enough skills to find a different job. So instead, once they received their independence, they had to turn back around and ask that same farmer who owned them if they could get a job there. So now they have a job working for the same farmer, paid very little, and now they have to pay really high taxes. So we would think that their life would improve. But what actually happened, they were probably more poor and unhappy than they were before. And we know that if people are poor and unhappy, eventually they are going to rebel. We know that answer. Okay, and that's going to come in the early 1900s. Okay, so people's lives were poor and unhappy. We know that. Okay, and then what ends up happening is that one person is going to take advantage. They're going to see the opportunity to take over. Okay, and this time is going to become the time during World War I. So in 1914, World War I starts. Okay, Russia had a series of defeats where they were taken over in multiple times. Okay, and what's going to end up happening is that's going to lead to food shortages, people's lives are bad, and one person is going to realize that this is the opportunity to take over all of Russia. And that's going to be the man that you're looking at, even though my head is in the way here. Okay, so the man that you're looking at is a man named V.I. Lenin, or Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin comes up with a great idea. And in February of 1917, that idea is going to start. His idea is to start a revolution, get all these people together. They were called the Bolsheviks. They were a workers' party. And they were going to storm the capital, St. Petersburg, and they were going to take over the government. Okay, and these are thousands of people all working together. So in February of 1917, led by Vladimir Lenin, he's the fighter, the revolutionary. Okay, he's going to lead these people into St. Petersburg, and they're going to throw a riot, the biggest one they've ever seen. Okay, Tsar Nicholas II at this time is going to send out his government troops to stop the riot. When the government troops came out into the square, okay, what's going to happen is exactly the opposite of what Nicholas predicted. The government troops are going to join those rioters. And when the government troops join the rioters, they all storm the castle and force Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, to step down. Now, when we say step down, that really means that they're going to execute him. Okay, if you know about the story of Anastasia, there was a movie about it. This was the story about her when she was the one that got out of the castle. She was the only Romanov that survived. Okay, so when Tsar Nicholas II abdicated and Lenin now is successful in this revolution, what's going to happen is that they have to figure out what's their new government going to be. Okay, so Lenin decided to base the new government off of the man in this picture. Okay, the man in this picture is a guy named Karl Marx. Karl Marx was not a fighter. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a guy that came up with an idea. And the idea that Karl Marx came up with, okay, was the idea of communism. So if you think about communism, communism is going to be this idea that all people are equal, okay, and they should be able to own land and businesses and so on, and that's where they would be in common, hence the word communism. Okay, so Karl Marx has this idea and Lenin is going to run with it. Okay, and that's when the Soviet Union, the USSR, is going to start. So the Soviet Union becomes a communist nation. They decided that Lenin is going to be the dictator of this nation. Okay, so when they set up the Soviet Union, what they're going to decide to do is that each area is going to have its own Soviets governing council, kind of like a state government. Okay, and each governing council is going to enforce something called the command economy. The command economy was one of our vocab terms. Okay, the command economy is going to be a type of economy where the government controls every single thing. Okay, so the government controls what's produced, how much is produced, how much to sell it for. People had no choices, no rights, no freedoms. Okay, so if we look at this life in the Soviet Union, when they embraced the revolution, they thought everything would get better. It didn't. Okay, it stayed the same in many situations. It got worse. One good thing came out of communism, and the one good thing you are going to have to know for your test. Okay, the one good thing about communism is that since the government had control over everything and the government wants to become rich, in a factory they're going to set the production goal really, really high. because they want to make as much money as possible. So the one good aspect of communism is that Russia, as a country, made a lot of money. Not that the people were really happy, but the country made a lot of money at this time. That's where we're going to wrap up for today. In our next video segment, we're going to look at how communism worked and the ultimate failure of communism.